Hey guys, we're starting chapter 14, and I just want to give you a heads up that as I'm recording, the rain has started outside. So I hope you can't hear it too much in the background, but if you do hear something, that's probably what it is. So just wanted to let you know. All right, here we get started on chapter 14, and this is another one of those moments where I read the title of the chapter and I'm like, oh no, what's going to happen, especially now that we're coming towards the end of the book. So you should take a second to pause the screen and make a prediction of what you think is going to happen. It's titled Black Feet and Bad Luck. And I'm trying to remember that moment from on their journey to the West where they were coming across the plains or leaving the plains over to the Rocky Mountains. Is that where all of the cactus needles and stuff were that kept stabbing into their moccasins? I can't remember. That is something that if I actually had the book in my hand, I would love to go back and check the text before I continued reading, just to try and make some connections of their timeline. But let's get started and see what's to come and see if your predictions come true. All right, July 3rd through August 12th, 1806. Seamen paced through the camp at the Travelers' Rest as the men laid out supplies in packed boxes. Something was different about the bustle today in the camp. Seaman sensed it, and it made him restless. Early on the morning of July 3rd, the men loaded their supplies on the horses, but they didn't climb onto the horses and ride off. Instead, they stood around, shaking hands and slapping backs. George Shannon knelt down and stroked Seaman's fur. "I'm really going to miss you, fellow," he said. The Corps of Discovery was about to separate into smaller groups to explore different routes home. The captains wanted to report to President Jefferson about the easiest way to cross the continent. Although the Corps of Discovery had reached the Pacific, their westbound trip had been very long. Before returning to the United States, the captains decided to try some shortcuts that the Indians had described to them. Captain Lewis planned to take some of the explorers on a route that they went directly east from Travelers' Rest. His group would begin by going north a short, long way to the Clark River. When the river forked, they would turn east and go upstream over the Continental Divide to the Medicine River. Flowing east, the Medicine River would take them to the Missouri River near the Great Falls. At Great Falls, Lewis would send some of his men to dig up the caches that they made before crossing the Rockies and retrieve their canoes. Lewis would take a few scouts to explore the land around the Marias River. He ran into some of the Blackfoot Indians. He could tell them about their new white father and his hopes for trade and peace. After his scouting trip, Lewis and his group would travel east by canoe on the Missouri River. Captain Clark's route started south along the Clark River. From there, his group would head northeast over the Continental Divide. When they reached the Jefferson, they would follow it downstream into Three Forks and turn east. When they reached Yellowstone River, they would make canoes for traveling downstream, northeast, until the Yellowstone River flowed into the Missouri. If the plan worked as the captains hoped, the Corps of Discovery would reunite at the junction of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers in about a month. Each group would travel separately for nearly 1,000 miles. Before leaving, each captain said farewell to the explorers and the other's group. Charbonneau's family was assigned to travel with Captain Clark while Lewis said goodbye. He clasped Sacagawea's hands and looked into her eyes. In a serious voice, he said, "I'm worried about Pomp, Janie. We've never traveled on the Yellowstone River, and we don't know how fast the waters flow. If one of the canoes capsizes—" Clark put a steady hand on Lewis's shoulder. "We'll all be fine, Meriwether." Lewis turned to his co-captain and continued, "The Yellowstone River may be swollen with the runoff of the mountain snows, William. Remember how much snow fell last year?" Lewis paused. "Maybe you should take seamen with your group in case somebody falls into the river and needs to be pulled to shore." Seaman whined softly at the sound of his name. He wagged his tail eagerly. Clark smiled at the dog and patted his head. "We'll be fine, Meriwether," Clark repeated. "All the men will keep an eye on Pomp in the rough waters, and yours is more dangerous route. You'll need seamen to guard your supplies while you explore the country around you and the Marias River. That's Blackfoot territory, and we don't know those Indians, how they will react to white men." Seaman looked at the captain's faces. Again he whined, unsure about the nervous tone that he heard in their voices. Clark knelt down and let the dog lick his face. I'll miss you, Seaman. He stroked the dog's fur, and then he walked over to the men standing near the horses. Good luck, men, he said, shaking each man's hand. God willing, we will be together again in about a month. While the captain spoke with the men, Sacagawea sat beside Seaman. She slipped Pomp off her back and let him touch the dog's fur. Seaman licked Pomp's face and laid a paw on the woman's lap. York flopped down beside Sacagawea. He picked up Pomp and lightly tossed him in the air. Pomp giggled and kicked his legs quietly. I don't know why I said quietly. I skipped ahead, sorry. In this place, the mountains part from the land, and Sacagawea said quietly, Everywhere I look, sadness of parting fills my heart. Cheer up, Janie, York said. The captains are just splitting us up to do a little bit of exploring. Our group will be traveling down the Yellowstone River because Captain Clark says that's probably an easier route home. But Captain Lewis and Seaman and the others will catch up with us soon. Sacagawea sat silently for a minute. Then she looked at York and nodded. I have also stood in the shadow of these mountains and seen great gladness. You'll see great gladness again, York said, and he patted the Indian woman's shoulder. The captains know what they're doing. The Corps of Discovery will be back together again in a few weeks. Then we'll head downstream for the Manton and the Hidassite villages. Seaman rolled onto his back and York scratched his belly. I'm sure I'm going to miss you, boy, he said. I'll tell you what. I'll watch out for Captain Clark and Sacagawea and Little Pomp, and you take care of Captain Lewis. Seaman scrambled back to his feet and York held out a stick and Seaman grabbed it and pulled. Pomp wrapped his chubby hands around the middle of the stick. No fair, York said to the baby. You're trying to help Seaman win. The captains called their groups and mounted their horses. Before they began to ride, the men turned to wave, and Seaman barked as they separated. Godspeed, William, Lewis shouted as he led the group along the Clark River. We'll see you at the junction of Yellowstone and the Missouri Rivers, called Clark. In early August. Be careful, Meriwether. And his group turned south. Lewis started his trip with Seaman, some of the men and horses, and the Nez Perce guides. The Indians stayed with Lewis for one day to be sure that he was on the correct route. Then they said it was time for them to rejoin their people. Lewis thanked the guides before he waved goodbye. The Nez Perce had been good friends to the Corps of Discovery. Without their kindness and knowledge, the explorers might not have survived. Lewis's group passed a stream on July 5th, and the captains named it Seaman Creek in honor of his dog. As their group traveled along the east of the river, Seaman smelled a familiar odors of game. Beaver lodges dotted the edges of the river. Deer came to the riverbanks to drink. The explorers passed herds of antelope. On July 7th, Seaman went hunting with some of the men, and the hunters wounded a large moose. The moose bellowed, blood spurting from its flank, and bolted into the trees. Suddenly it stopped, turned and faced the hunters. It lowered its antlers and glared at the men as if it was about to charge. Seaman chased it away. They proceeded on. The men talked eagerly about reaching buffalo country, and finally, on July 9th, the hunters brought back a buffalo. Lewis decided to make camp and let his group enjoy the feast of tender buffalo meat. The next day, Lewis's group came to a herd of buffalo. Seaman sniffed their familiar earthly odor, a mixture of sweaty fur and overchurned dirt. The huge buffalo bulls bellowed at the cows, noisily picking their mates. The animals milled around, bumping into each other and pushing and snorting. The bellowing continued all evening through the night. It was so loud the explorers' horses became skittish, but the men didn't complain. To them, this was the sound of juicy meat ready to be roasted over open fires. During the evenings, Lewis wrote in his journal by the light of a campfire. He noted that he was much rejoiced at finding ourselves in the plains of the Missouri, which abound with game. Looking across, where did that go? Y'all, I'm so sorry. I was reading and I got distracted because I got an alert on my phone. Okay, here we are. Looking out across the grasses swaying in the wind, Lewis remembered the way the western sea looked on a calm day. The grasses rippled like green waves stretching as far as he could see. There were no trees or bushes to break up the line of the horizon. Facing the seas of grass, Lewis felt like a small creature in a vast world. To Lewis, the plains stood for plenty. Plenty of grass, plenty of game, plenty of furs. But one part of the plenty made him feel less than poetic: the mosquitoes. Once again, the men had to smear their hands and necks with grease to protect themselves from an army of mosquitoes. They stood in the smoke of the fires to be free of the buzzing pests. They slept under the netting that they carried in their packs. In spite of the greases in the netting, the men's faces swelled from the mosquito bites. The pests followed poor Seaman, buzzing around his eyes and mouth. Lewis wrote in his journal, "My dog even howls with the torture he experiences from them. They are so numerous that we frequently get them in our throats as we breathe." I think that's another word for throats. Let's see. Oops, maybe it's a typo. The hunters complained that they could not take the aim to shoot because the mosquitoes formed a thick cloud before their eyes. When Lewis's group reached the roaring, rushing waters of the Great Falls, they made camp. On July 16th, Lewis gave his group instructions before he began his scouting trip. The men should retrieve the supplies left in the caches last summer and bring back all the canoes. They should carry all the gear around the falls. When they finished, they were to wait by the river guarding the supplies until Lewis returned. Lewis chose 3 of the men and some of the horses to go with him to explore the Marias River. Before he left camp, he called Seaman. "I'm going to leave you here at the river, fellow." Seaman cocked his head as Lewis talked. Lewis grinned at the alert of the expression on the dog's face. He knelt and stroked Seaman's head. "Seaman, I need you to guard our camp again," he said, rubbing his thick fur on Seaman's chest. As soon as Lewis stood up, Seaman scrambled to his feet. "Stay, Seaman," Lewis said, and he mounted the horse. Seaman sat, watching Lewis's face eagerly. Lewis told the men to keep the dog in camp so he wouldn't follow the horses. Then he and the scouts rode away. In the days that followed, the men loaded the horses with baggage. They brought back the supplies from the caches and retrieved the canoes. They tied ropes to the canoes so that the horses could pull them on makeshift wagons. Seaman and one man stood guard over the baggage as the others rode, leading the pack horses around the waterfalls. This time, the portage went quickly, since the men weren't carrying their supplies on foot over the prickly pears. After the portage, they made camp downstream for the Great Falls and got canoes ready to continue traveling. After the hard work was finished, Seaman paddled around camp. He leaped to his feet when he heard the sound of hoofbeats, but the sounds were made by the horses left in camp and not by Lewis returning. The men repacked their supplies. They hunted and they worried about their captain's safety. After all, Lewis had gone deep into Blackfoot country with only 3 men. The Blackfoot Indians were feared by all the Indians who hunted on the plains, the Shoshones, the Hidassites, and the Mandans. Perhaps Captain Lewis was in danger. But the men didn't know where he was, so how could they go to his rescue? Seaman stayed close to John Colter while Lewis was away. When Colter went hunting, Seaman ran beside him. Around the campfire in the evenings, Colter stroked Seaman's fur, and at night the dog snuggled close to Colter's bedroll. Although Seaman rested his head on his paws and he shut his eyes, he was always listening for the sound of hoofbeats. Day after day, Seaman listened, and day after day there was no sign of Captain Lewis. Finally, on July 28th, nearly 2 weeks after Lewis had ridden away on the scouting party, Seaman heard the pounding of horses' hooves running hard across the plains. He began to bark and dashed up the river bank to the tall grasses. Lewis and his scouts were coming, and they were riding swiftly and shouting and waving their hats at the men in camp. Captain Lewis jumped off his horse and breathlessly greeted Seaman and the men. He knelt to stroke Seaman as he told their story. "We met a party of Blackfoot braves and camped with us, and when they thought we were asleep, they tried to steal our weapons, and they were going to disarm us and kill us. The scoundrels! And as soon as we began to fight them off, they tried to drive away our horses, so we'd be stranded." I'm stopping here, guys. I'll pick up right here with Lewis.